Committee will come to order. I want to thank my colleagues on this committee and our witnesses and everyone for joining us today for this important discussion about the state of affordable housing in America. Housing is a deeply personal issue, frankly, to all of us, I think, and frankly, to me as well. My brother and I grew up in poverty. I've said that several times. My mother did everything possible to keep a roof over our head and frankly to steer us towards a better life. I learned early on that housing is not just about having that roof over your head, it's really about the opportunity to build a better future. Owning a home has long been the pillar of the American dream, but for too many Americans today, working families today, that dream has slipped further and further out of reach. We must confront the reality that during the Biden administration, housing affordability reached record lows. Mortgage rates have grown by over 150% under President Biden, from just under 2.67% on average in January 2021 to 7% by 2024. Meanwhile, rents have surged by nearly 25% in that same time, putting more pressure on those unable to buy homes and forcing many into unstable living situations. Perhaps the most devastating statistic of all is that homelessness has hit a record high, an 18% increase in just 12 months, and a 30% increase since COVID ended. This raises an important question. Why do we continue to confront roadblocks despite massive government investment and support? The hard truth is government interference is perhaps more of the problem than the government resources are the solution. Spending trillions of dollars on the housing market is not the answer. Today, we will hear from leaders and experts about what needs to be done. We are honored to have with us today Eric Johnson, the mayor of Dallas, Texas. Go Cowboys. A local official who understands the challenges of housing at the community level. We have Lee Jelinek with us, the Chief Information Officer of United Wholesale Mortgage, who can speak to the impact of federal housing policies, and also Edward Glazer, a respected academic from Harvard University who brings a much-needed perspective on the economics of housing, and Renee Willis, the interim president and CEO of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. The good news is we have a diverse group of experts who could speak to the issue that impacts all Americans in a way that I believe will improve our ability as a committee to get things done, frankly, not even in a bipartisan fashion, in a nonpartisan fashion. This is about American people finding their path to the American dream and not about Republicans or Democrats scoring points or making points. Frankly, let's make a difference together. I look forward to your insights and discussing real, workable solutions to what most Americans consider a crisis. We need to take a different approach that embraces efficiency, deregulation, and getting the federal government out of the way. There are too many regulations at the federal, state, and local levels, in my opinion, having worked at all three levels of government, to actually building homes in the local communities, whether it's restrictive zoning laws, bureaucratic red tape, or misguided policies that drive up the cost of construction. Policymakers at all levels of government must take a hard look at what's really preventing the housing supply from keeping up with housing demand. That's why my legislation, the Road to Housing Act, seeks to make targeted reforms that will actually work. This legislation would reduce regulatory barriers, streamline the development process, and ensure that taxpayer dollars are used most effectively. I've seen firsthand from local communities that they are best positioned to address their housing challenges. The federal government should not dictate a one-size-fits-all housing program. Instead, we must empower states and local governments to adopt policies encouraging responsible development and increasing housing supply. Let's be clear. Housing should not be a partisan issue. Can't say that enough, because it's just about people realizing their version of the American dream, plain and simple. That's why I urge my Democratic colleagues to work with me and all of our members on the right in our approach to the Road to Housing Act. By working together, we can reverse decades of failed housing policies and bring about real change for tens of millions of Americans who need it the most. I look forward to today's discussion and working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to advance policies that will restore the American dream of home ownership and put more Americans on the path to success while closing the gap on wealth in this country. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing from our witnesses and our ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your holding this hearing. I know that you care deeply about addressing the housing crisis, and I hope we will be able to work together to lower housing costs for families. The crisis we face today is massive. We have a nationwide shortage of about 5 million homes. And these shortages drive up rents. They push home ownership out of the reach of millions of families. 40 years ago, the cost of a house for a Boston public school teacher was about 4.5 times their salary. Today, that same Boston public school teacher would need about 11 times their salary to buy a home. Housing feels unaffordable because housing is unaffordable. We do not have enough housing, and nothing gets better if we don't build more housing. So, how do we increase the housing supply? Housing is local, but for decades, states and towns have fallen further and further behind. The federal government can be a good partner to help boost housing supply and to make the housing market work better for families. Fortunately, there is no shortage of good and, in many cases, bipartisan work done by members on this committee that would help get us started. And I just want to mention a few. Senator Smith has a bill with Senator Rounds, the Rural Housing Service Reform Act. It would help protect and expand affordable housing supply in rural areas. Senator Warner has a bill with Senator Crapo, the Scaling Community Lenders Act, which would help fuel more lending and investment in low-income and underserved communities. Senator Cortez Masto has a bill, the Price Act, which would help upgrade and preserve manufactured homes. She also has the Home Investment Partnerships Reauthorization and Improvement Act, which would help local communities finance new construction, home repairs, and other housing needs. Senator Van Hollen has a bill with Senator Young, the Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act, which would give more families with young children access to safe and stable housing. Senator Reed has a bill with Senator Haggerty, the Homebuyers Privacy Protection Act, that would protect prospective homebuyers' personal information from predatory lenders. Senator Lummis has a bill with Senator Fetterman, the Whole Home Repairs Act, that would help homeowners and small landlords make essential repairs that keep homes safe and livable. Senator Gallega has a bill, the Housing Vouchers Fairness Act, that would help more families in high-growth states afford housing. Senator Blunt Rochester has a bill, the Reducing Regulatory Barriers to Housing Act, that would support state and local governments that want to update their zoning laws to build more affordable housing. Senator Warnock has a bill, the Down Payment Toward Equity Act, which would support first-time, first-generation home buyers. I'm glad to partner with Senators Warnock, Van Hollen, and Kim on my American Housing and Economic Mobility Act, which would help build nearly 3 million new affordable homes and lower rents across the country by an estimated 10%. There are different approaches we could take to help address the housing crisis, but ideas like these should get us started, and I hope we can consider these and other bills as our committee looks forward to passing meaningful housing legislation this year. I just want to close by mentioning the assault on HUD. In the past few weeks, HUD Secretary Turner and Elon Musk's Doge have frozen affordable housing development projects across the country. They have also made it easier for landlords to deny people housing because of a disability or how they look, and they have rolled out plans to lay off half of HUD's workforce. These actions will make it harder, not easier, for families to access housing, and they will raise housing costs. If the federal government is going to be a good partner to local communities to address the housing crisis, we need a well-resourced and well-staffed HUD. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Warren. We will now hear from today's witnesses. We'll start with Mayor Johnson. You are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and distinguished members of this committee for the opportunity to speak to you on the critical issues of homelessness and housing affordability in our country. My name is Eric Johnson, and I have the honor of serving as the 60th mayor of Dallas, Texas. I was born and raised in Dallas. Growing up in low-income household, my family bounced around between cramped apartments and small rental homes, and I know firsthand what housing insecurity feels like and how important stable housing is for families. It's true that in Dallas, we've made some noteworthy gains in addressing both homelessness and housing affordability. Last year, we effectively ended veteran homelessness by ensuring that any veteran who falls into homelessness is housed within 90 days. This achievement means that in Dallas, the men and women who served our country are treated with dignity. But honestly, I don't want to spend the time so graciously allotted me by this esteemed committee bragging about what Dallas has done right. Instead, I want to try to help this committee understand what I've learned about both homelessness and housing affordability from serving on the front lines as the mayor of America's 9th largest city. Over the past 6 years, I've come to understand that two major misconceptions stand in the way of real progress. If we don't correct these misconceptions, we will never move the needle on chronic homelessness or housing affordability in our nation's cities. The first misconception is that housing affordability is the primary driver of chronic homelessness. Homelessness is a complex issue, and affordable housing is a critical component of the solution. However, the overwhelming majority of the chronically homeless are not living on our streets because of housing affordability. They're doing so because they struggle with serious mental illnesses, drug addiction, and psychological and behavioral disorders. Chronic homelessness is primarily a public health issue, but we're not addressing it as such. It is not primarily a housing affordability issue, and it's not even a public safety issue at its core. Although we can and should enforce local laws prohibiting camping in public spaces and in public buildings, we cannot arrest our way out of chronic homelessness. We must shift our focus toward thinking about chronic homelessness more as a public health issue and less as a housing or public safety issue. The second misconception is connected to the fact that many discuss and even shape policy related to housing as though it is not a market, when it in fact is. Like in any other market, housing prices are determined by supply and demand. Therefore, the most effective way to bring down housing prices is to encourage the private sector to increase home building throughout the United States, but particularly in cities like Dallas, where we see unprecedented demand for our existing housing stock because of our economic growth and success. Now, keep in mind, government itself is not an effective housing developer, but what government can do is step aside, cut the red tape, and encourage the private sector to build more homes faster. In Dallas, we have shown that reducing barriers to home building works. We've cut permitting times, streamlined zoning, and worked with private developers to increase housing starts. Over the past few years, we've prioritized efficiency, and as a result, we slashed the median time to issue a residential building permit from 68 days in 2022 to just 8 days in 2024. This expedited permitting process has enabled developers to bring new housing to the market more quickly, helping us to meet the skyrocketing demand for housing in Dallas. I strongly believe that the most effective thing Congress can do to make housing more affordable for everyday Americans is not to create yet another federal program that pours millions of taxpayer dollars into subsidizing the already robust demand side of the housing equation. What I need right now, as the mayor of Dallas, the heart of the fastest growing metropolitan area in the United States, is for Congress to reframe the narrative around homelessness and housing affordability by correcting the misconceptions that I've just discussed. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you, and I look forward to doing the very best I can to answer any of your questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Lee Jelenic, good to see you again. Thank you for being here and sharing your knowledge as well. You're next.
Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Warren, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to appear at today's hearing. My name is Lee Jelenic, and I am the Chief Innovation Officer at United Wholesale Mortgage. United Wholesale Mortgage started in 1986, and we have grown to 9,000 team members who come to work every day at our state-of-the-art headquarters in Pontiac, Michigan. We support over 10,000 independent mortgage brokers across all 50 states. Since 2022, we have been the #1 overall mortgage lender in the U.S. We operate exclusively in the wholesale channel, which means we don't lend directly to consumers. We serve mortgage brokers as our clients. To give you a sense of our scale, we funded approximately 1 in 10 mortgages in the United States last year. Homeownership remains to be the most significant source of financial stability for American families, and United Wholesale Mortgage, as the largest mortgage lender in America, takes seriously our responsibility of maximizing the accessibility and availability of financing so that more people can achieve the dream of homeownership. While the system to facilitate mortgage financing is functioning today, there are some clear and actionable ways to improve the status quo. But before turning to the solutions, I would like to first highlight 3 significant headwinds to making homeownership more attainable: interest rates, supply, and costs embedded in the mortgage process. First, I will address interest rates. For the past 3 years, consumers have been facing interest rate sticker shock. To put this in perspective, there are over $2.5 trillion worth of mortgages at a rate at or above 6% in our country today. And that is most of the loans originated in the past 2 years. This compares to rates that were between 2 and 5% from 2020 to 2022. Second, there are simply not enough houses available at any price to keep up with demand. The short supply in combination with higher rates creates an environment where homeowners stay put in their homes longer than the typical 7 to 9 years. We call this the lock-in effect. With people locked in their homes and not moving up like they normally would, new home buyers are frozen out of the market. Third and finally, there are opportunities to reduce the costs embedded in obtaining a mortgage that do not involve lower credit standards or risky underwriting. Rather, all it requires is an embrace of technology and data available to market participants today. To address these challenges, Congress, FHFA, and HUD can act with purpose and urgency to improve mortgage affordability. First, we believe some competition between the 2 GSEs is necessary to increase the responsible flow of credit and achieve greater efficiency and affordability in the mortgage process. Policymakers should reevaluate any FHFA-imposed rules that prevent the GFEs from competing with each other, specifically on volume and innovation. One example of an FHFA conservatorship policy that has stifled innovation is FHFA's New Activities Rule. It significantly curtails the GSE's ability to seek opportunities for innovation and keep up with the advances made by well-run lenders in the private sector. When the GSEs compete under the watchful eye of the regulators, they can offer better products and policies, often through pilot programs, to attract lenders who ultimately pass these benefits on to borrowers. For lenders like UWM, competition among the GSEs via pilot programs and innovation means our advances in technology can ultimately be accessed by more Americans. Secondly, we need to streamline the mortgage process without increasing homeowner, lender, or systemic risk by allowing innovations in technology to replace traditional paper-based processes. One such area is title insurance. Some solutions have been introduced to the market. Mortgage lenders and the GSEs must be incentivized to further innovate. Another area ripe for technology and database improvements are appraisals. By increasing the adoption of virtual appraisals and appraisal waivers, modern data and analytics can be used to save consumers money. And as a final example, more competition between the GSEs could also have the effect of incentivizing the credit bureaus to compete not only on price, but on accuracy, reliability, and consumer accountability. In conclusion, Congress should support FHFA in increasing competition by and between Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, and Congress can also support FHFA and HUD's efforts to reduce consumer costs by harnessing the power of innovation to make homeownership more accessible and affordable to all Americans. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today. I look forward to answering your questions, and I would like to invite any members of this committee out to our campus in Pontiac, Michigan, to talk more about how we can continue to help Americans achieve the dream of homeownership.
Thank you, sir, very much. Dr. Glazer?
Thank you, Chairman Scott. Thank you, Ranking Member Warren. Thank you, committee members. I am grateful and honored to have the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm an economist who has spent much of the last quarter century studying what has gone wrong with America's housing markets. Initially, I worried about the high costs and limited supply in coastal America because I watched as the real price of housing in Boston tripled between 1980 and 2006. Until the last decade, the cost of housing in cities like Atlanta, Dallas, and Houston remained affordable, largely because these Sunbelt cities built a lot of homes. But that has changed. Between the end of 2009 and the end of 2024, the real price of housing doubled in Phoenix and rose by 55% in Atlanta. The median new home price is now $635,000 in Miami, $476,000 in Phoenix, and $450,000 in Charleston, South Carolina. The critical fact about America's current housing crisis is that it is driven by a lack of supply of new homes. We live in a land of plenty, and yet we have manufactured a shortage of basic living space. Economists sort out supply and demand by looking at prices and quantities. If prices are up and building is up, then we know demand is to blame. If prices are up and building is down, then it's a supply problem. As the next exhibit shows, home building across the U.S. collapsed after the global financial crisis and has yet to recover. We are producing fewer single-family homes at the start of 2025 than we did at the start of 2021, and 38% less than we did 20 years ago. The next exhibit shows that places in America that are expensive don't build a lot, and places that build a lot aren't expensive. There is demand for homes in California, and there is demand for homes in Texas. Right? But Texas builds much more, and it remains much more affordable. The combination of high prices and limited building means that America has a supply problem, despite the fact that we lack neither land nor construction capacity. The next exhibit uses the Wharton Index of Local Land Use Regulation and shows that prices are much higher in places with more local land use regulation. This is a problem because ordinary Americans have to spend too much on housing. The nationwide ratio of home prices to median income has reached 5.6 in 2022, the highest ratio in recorded history. 39% of spending by renter households goes on housing. 56% of Californians told a recent poll that they had considered leaving the state because of high housing costs. Our country is also less productive because we build too little in our most productive places. Nobel laureate Ed Prescott and two co-authors find that U.S. labor productivity would be 12.4% higher, and consumption would be 12% higher if all U.S. states moved halfway from their current land use regulation levels to the current Texas level. Throughout our history, Americans have made our country stronger by moving to more productive places. 19th century New Englanders left our rocky soil to find better farms in the Ohio River Valley. 20th century refugees from the Dust Bowl found a brighter future in California. Yet today, we see no migration to more productive places because we don't allow building there and because it is too expensive. The next exhibit shows the relation between the Wharton Land Use Regulation Index and the level of upward mobility experienced by poorer children. The places that provide the brightest economic prospects for poor children make it hardest to build. The federal government has long fought for affordability with demand-side policies, such as the home mortgage interest deduction and housing vouchers. But demand-side policies can be counterproductive when the fundamental problem is restricted supply. If homes were abundantly supplied at $250,000 each, then demand-side subsidies would primarily benefit the households that get those subsidies. But if the number of homes is fixed, then demand-side subsidies just push up prices. If there are 1,000 homes in a neighborhood and there are 1,001 buyers, each willing to pay $500,000 for a home, then providing each of them with a $50,000 tax credit just pushes the price to $550,000. So what could work? We could reconfigure existing supply-side policies, such as the low-income housing tax credit, but there is a lot of work to do. One recent study found that the average cost to build a low-income unit in California was $708,000. A better alternative may be to encourage states and localities to permit more private construction. But here's the rub. America's tradition of federalism is strong, and we should never want Washington to micromanage local zoning codes. An alternative that respects state and local sovereignty is to use existing federal spending to encourage more construction. We could tie a state's eligibility for discretionary federal infrastructure grants to building new housing in its most productive counties. Transportation-related grants are natural because the benefits of transportation spending are tied to the number of people who are able to live nearby. Moreover, our high housing cost problem is closely linked to our high infrastructure cost problem, and so it's natural for transportation and housing committees to work together. We could take the most productive large counties in the U.S. 119 counties collectively produce more than one-half of America's national income, and they're spread throughout our country, from Richland County, South Carolina, to Middlesex County, Massachusetts. We could allocate homes to those counties, and if states have those counties and they build enough, they get priority on grants. If they have those counties and don't build a lot, they don't get priority. And if they don't have any of those counties, it doesn't impact them at all. It's just one idea. My hope is that these incentives will induce states and localities to find their own solutions. We want local creativity, but we also want a nation that makes space for outsiders, and our nation is not currently doing that. I want to end again by thanking the committee for taking up this topic and for giving me the chance to speak.
Thank you, Dr. Glazer. Next, we'll hear from Ms. Willis.
Chair Scott, Ranking Member Warren, and members of the Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs, it is an honor to testify before you today. The nation is experiencing a pervasive and growing affordable housing crisis, impacting rural, urban, suburban, and tribal communities alike. Most renters, particularly those with the lowest incomes, are struggling to keep a roof over their heads, and a record number of people are experiencing homelessness. The National Low-Income Housing Coalition's latest research, which will be published tomorrow, has found a national shortage of 7.1 million rental homes affordable and available to extremely low-income households. This shortage is a structural feature of our country's housing system, impacting every state and congressional district in the country. Despite the clear, urgent need for additional resources, Congress only provides enough housing assistance to serve 1 in 4 eligible households. Without affordable homes, 3 out of every 4 extremely low-income households spend over half of their income on rent, leaving them without the resources they need to put food on the table or otherwise to make ends meet. These households are often a single missed paycheck or unexpected expense away from facing eviction and, in worst cases, homelessness. To fully address America's affordable housing and homelessness crisis, Congress must bridge the gap between incomes and housing costs through universal rental assistance, build and preserve rental homes affordable to people with the lowest incomes, prevent evictions and homelessness by stabilizing families during a crisis, and strengthen and enforce renter protections to address the power imbalance that tilts heavily in favor of landlords. In 2025, Congress can and should advance bipartisan housing package to help make meaningful strides towards this goal. We urge you to act quickly to enact meaningful solutions despite the challenging political times. As we discuss the importance of housing solutions, I must also address an immediate threat facing HUD, and by extension, the communities and people HUD serves. Elon Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, proposed to fire half of HUD's current workforce. Without adequate staff to administer and oversee these funds, states and communities will face new barriers to accessing the critical federal resources they need to pay the rent, build affordable housing, address homelessness, recover from disasters, revitalize distressed communities, promote homeownership, enforce fair housing laws, and more. Rather than improving efficiency, such drastic staffing cuts at HUD will cause significant harmful and costly delays and will worsen America's affordable housing and homelessness crisis, as well as its significant disaster recovery needs. Delays in accessing federal resources will slow down affordable housing construction and drive up development costs, slow recovery after disasters, and cause organizations that rely on federal funding like homeless services agencies to limit services or close their doors altogether. We are also deeply concerned about DOGE's efforts to unilaterally withhold funding approved by Congress and terminate contracts. Funding for homelessness, fair housing, technical assistance, and capacity building have been wrongly withheld or canceled. Unless this funding is released soon, it could cause irreparable harm. Victims of discrimination will have no way to enforce their rights under the law, and shelters may have no choice but to close their doors and turn unhoused people onto the streets. I look forward to opportunities to work together to protect and expand federal housing investments and protect the federal agency staff necessary to administer and oversee these funds to help address the affordable housing needs of communities all across this nation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. We'll start our questions with Senator Kennedy. I'll defer to Senator Kennedy, and then we'll go to Ranking Member Warren. Senator Kennedy, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you all for being here. Professor Glazer, you're head of the Department of Economics at Harvard? No longer. But you've taught there since 1992. Correct.
I think you need to turn your microphone on.
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
You did your PhD work at Chicago?
That's correct, sir.
Great school. You publish about 5 articles a year?
I don't know. I've published a few.
I appreciate your testimony because you not only talked about the problem, but you talked about possible solutions. No disrespect to anybody, but revamping our appraisal process or title insurance or talking about power imbalances is not going to get homes built, not in a free enterprise country. Our problem is supply, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
And the main reason we have a problem with supply is because of land use regulation, isn't it?
I've been saying that for 25 years, Senator. Yes, I agree with that very strongly.
And land use, zoning, some would call it, is within the job description of, to some extent, state, but mostly local government. Is that right?
That's correct, sir.
And Congress has a history, it seems to me. You can disagree, certainly, if you do, of just throwing money at the problem and trying to tell local government how to get more houses built. And local government takes the money and pushes back because politicians at the local level, they like to eat and live indoors too, and they like to get reelected, and they don't want to make anybody upset by changing land use regulation in a way to encourage more housing. Would that be a fair assessment? My words, though, not yours.
I will not disagree with any of those words, Senator.
Okay. There's a plan that's been talked about in Canada. And what the Canadians have, they're talking about it. It hasn't been implemented, but the proponent of the plan, I've talked with Senator Warren about this, has said, look, we need to incent local government to increase housing starts, but we need to use a carrot and a stick. What if America had a law, Congress passed a statute that said, look, we don't care how you do it, states, but you need to increase your housing starts by 3, 4, 5% a year. Do it however you want to do it. If you do that, we will give you extra federal money. If you don't do that, we will take federal money away from you until you start doing it. Would that work?
If you're willing to champion such legislation, Senator, I'm willing to be behind you. I think there are challenges with that in the U.S. The difficulties of taking away spending that was already expected may be particularly hard. It may be easier to do with discretionary grants than with spending that's targeted. I also think it needs to be targeted not to the state's level of production, but to production in the most productive parts of the state. Right? We don't want California to meet its requirements by building in areas that are very far away from Los Angeles or San Francisco, and and so forth. But I think basically something that creates carrots and ideally sticks as well, that tries to encourage states to do the right thing. And from my perspective, the battleground of affordable housing is in places like the California state legislature. And I would love those legislators who want to do the right thing, who want to make California a state for outsiders, to be able to say, look, the federal government is pushing us in this direction too. Can we just not lose our spending for X? Can we do this? And I think that would be very powerful in the hands of state
legislators. Who would be best to decide the most productive areas to incent housing?
I would use Bureau of Economic Analysis numbers of output per capita. I don't think it's but this can be debated. We can lots of people. I would not hand it over to an agency though. I would put it directly in the legislation.
Do you think our problem in America with housing is caused by a power imbalance?
I'm not sure I know what that means.
Me neither. Me neither. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Thanks, sir. Ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I think we all agree here. We need to build more housing. Housing for seniors, housing for students, housing for veterans, for renters, for first-time home buyers, for families in rural areas, for families in cities, housing for pretty much everyone who isn't already rich and doesn't already own a home. And there are a lot of drivers behind the housing shortage. It's a reason why we need to use a lot of different tools, I think, to expand how we approach housing. Factors driving the housing shortage, it seems to me, include outdated building codes, local land use restrictions that prevent new housing from being built. For example, according to one estimate, it's illegal to build apartments, townhomes, or anything but single-family detached homes on 3/4 of the residential land in cities and suburbs across America. So, Dr. Glazer, just help us understand at a little bit more granular level. Walk us through the problem about local restrictions and how they, like exclusionary use or zoning or building codes, and how they drive up the cost of housing.
So there are 1,000 different ways to say no. And in Greater Boston, which you know as well as I do, I have spent a lot of time studying NIMBYism in its different forms. And it starts by making it hard to manufacture at scale. So it starts by requiring that you get sort of these tiny projects instead of the large-scale building that builders like the Levitts were doing after World War II, when you really had mass production of ordinary homes that sort of made things affordable. You get smaller projects. Then you get smaller projects that take 2 years to get approved. I mean, I'm amazed by 8 days. I'm just amazed by, most of our people are talking years. And the rules become so specific for particular towns. Forgive me for being Massachusetts-oriented. I know one builder who will not build outside of Lexington, Mass. Right? All of his skills are in Lexington, Mass, and he will not cross. And this is a small town, right? And just in general, just the difficulty of moving anything. Now, in Massachusetts, we do have a tradition of a state override. I mean, we have Massachusetts Chapter 40B, which allows an override for certain types of affordable housing projects. The last thing I would say is that 40B is the right model for other states, but it is a model that has been helpful in Massachusetts. And so this tradition of sort of fighting back and forth between state and local is a really important thing.
Okay, I think that's a really important thing to focus on, where the problem lies. And look, our job is not to tell local governments what to do, but we do have a responsibility to be a good partner to communities that actually want to build more housing and more housing that we need. So I have a bill right now with Senators Warnock and Van Hollen and Kim. It's called the American Housing and Economic Mobility Act, and it creates a competitive grant program. So it's the carrot end of the spectrum, and says that if a community will lower the cost of housing and actually produce more housing, then we'll put money on the table for other costs that come along with that. You can use it to build new elementary schools or new roads that you may need, or a new sewage plant that you may need, all of it supporting this housing. With Senator Kennedy, what we're working on right now is carrots and sticks, if that's what's needed here. But let me just ask, I think that Senator Kennedy was asking, but I want to be sure I've got this right. Dr. Glazer, do you think that's a way to expand supply?
I think that policies that nudge states and localities towards permitting more housing, to allowing the genius of American industry to get to work and build homes for ordinary Americans, I think those are very good policies for you to consider.
Okay, yes. And let me let you get in this as well, Ms. Willis. Do you think that this is a way to be able to expand supply?
Absolutely. Looking at your American Housing and Economic Mobility Act, absolutely, because you talk about the carrots, and there's definitely that in that bill, because you're incentivizing. There's an opportunity to incentivize and encourage better zoning practices. And from what I recall, there's also that competitive program that could really create a race to the top. Because, zoning reform is best handled at the state and local levels. But I think in your bill, there is that incentive, that carrot that you speak of, to incentivize innovation at the local and state levels.
And Mr. Jelinek, I'm running out of time, but can I just ask you, you're an expert in this area, is this something that likely could help us produce more supply?
Ranking Member Warren, thank you. I mean, we are focused mostly on the mortgage process.
I understand.
But yes, I mean, there clearly is a supply issue in the country right now.
Good. I just want to say this is not about the federal government imposing a one-size-fits-all, and that housing in Louisiana has to look like housing in Massachusetts or be built in the same ways. But it really is an incentive to get local governments to solve the problem they face, because let's face it, they've had 40 years and the problem has just gotten worse and worse and worse. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. Look forward to working with you on this.
This is an exciting time for us to have a nonpartisan conversation about solving needs in our country. I wish we would do this more often around every committee in the Senate, frankly, and in Congress. For those of you perhaps not aware, I spent 13 years, 6 months, 7 days, and 12 hours on local county council. And so,
But who's counting?
exactly, I was not excited to leave at all. I really enjoyed my time there, but I'll say without question that the issue of housing is very much a local issue. And frankly, while the state legislature can do some good, it's those communities who really have building caps that distorts the market in extraordinary ways. The way that they use their zoning laws and density requirements is in fact what has exacerbated the problem from California to New York and beyond. How does that happen? Well, your local communities decides they don't want anybody else moving in. It's like not everyone wants a wall built, but we're building this virtual wall outside of certain communities by saying we're not going to allow for any high density construction in these areas. And you add that on top of the construction cost and 7% interest rates, you have destroyed the local housing market. Mayor, you've done a fabulous job in Texas, from crime to improving safety to focusing on homelessness and reducing the amount of time it takes to get things done on every topic, it seems like, frankly. And I really appreciate your service to your community in many ways, to Texas and beyond. Can you talk about how you would address the issue from a zoning perspective, number one? Number two, compound question here, is the homelessness crisis is something we should all be passionate about. An 18% increase with record dollars being spent through HUD to address homelessness, and yet the problem gets worse. It's almost as if the more money we put out there, the worse the problem has gotten. I'm sure someone will rebuke me for that statement, but the truth of the matter is we seem to be dealing with something more complicated than here's a couple more dollars, let's solve the problem.
Well, I appreciate the question, and I'll do my best to tell you, in all cases, my perspective as the leader of a city on the policy side and the political side, as opposed to the bureaucratic side. But we're talking about something that's largely a bureaucratic issue, and so there's just a lot of the issues related to, specifically asked about zoning. I would also throw in with that permitting. This is process. This is about process, and this is about, in many cases, local governments not being sufficiently focused or perhaps incentivized to focus on their process and making it easier to do business with the city. Frankly, there are entities that exist in the world, in the United States in particular, that know how to build houses, know where houses need to be built, and can do so profitably, but are being hamstrung by local governments and how difficult it can be to navigate their process and how long it can take to bring a project to fruition. So we've had success, but it's not for no reason. I've had to really lean in over the past 6 years with the bureaucracy. Our bureaucracy is headed by a city manager in Dallas, but I've had to really impart upon them just how important it is that we prioritize getting down these permit wait times. This didn't just happen on its own. Departments had to be consolidated, staff had to be moved around, things had to be done. You had to reconfigure, how we went about serving the developer community, having meetings with folks about their projects, and just we had to be very creative about how we got projects done more quickly. And so that takes a concerted effort, and that's a process thing. I'm talking to the United States Senate right now, and so the question I think I want to not address here is, what can you do to help with that? I mean, I think we need some form of change in conversation around this topic of housing, because I think we get confused, frankly, and think that housing somehow is something that we, as the local level, can just determine the price of, and that there's nothing that housing is like everything else. The supply and demand determines the price of it, but we don't act that way. And I think we could use some help with changing that narrative around that. As far as homelessness is concerned, I would say similarly, we have a narrative problem. In a lot of ways, I've had to push back on the idea that the folks that you see sleeping on our streets are there because of the high median housing price in Dallas. And it's really not about that. The unhoused that you see on our streets are there for other reasons that I outlined before. So I think in addition to thinking about carrots and sticks and the things that Congress can do financially, we could use some help with changing the narrative around these topics to understand what the real root causes are.
Extending myself to 54 seconds you did not use in your opening statement. I'm going to continue
you.
for a question with Dr. Glazer. To me, the housing issue we have of affordability is, in fact, the more you suppress housing construction because of your zoning laws, the higher your prices are going to go in the communities. You're talking about a manufactured crisis. Please continue.
Well, I agree with that pretty strongly, Senator. So thank you for taking this up. I think this is exactly right. I mean, America is full of land, right? We are an abundantly rich country. This is not necessary. We did this to ourselves. We did this to ourselves by stopping the natural genius of American builders, by restraining them over and over again, by making it impossible to figure out new ways to build. Just look at what's happened to productivity in the construction industry. Every other industry, right, it soars. Construction has stagnated. It has stagnated in part because our projects are tiny, which means that our firms are tiny, and firms that have 4 people, 6 people don't have research and development departments. There was a time when construction was just as dynamic as every other industry, but because of this web of local land use regulations, it is no longer so.
Thank you, sir. Senator Kim is next.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you to the 4 of you for coming on. Mayor Johnson, I wanted to just start with you. In between fiscal year 2023 and 2024, your city received more than $31 million in federal funding through 4 grant programs. One of them was the Home Investment Partnership. I'm not too sure how much you're aware of how all that was used, but I wanted to see whether or not you're able to speak to whether or not that was helpful and important for your city in terms of understanding how to address the issue of household building of homes. So over to you.
So I can't speak specifically to exactly what those funds went to in terms of directly contributing to the number of housing starts that are attributable to that over that period of time. But what I will say is this, in a more general sense, I think there's a whole long list of federal housing programs that we've used over the years. Mostly focus on the construction of multifamily and rental housing units that I think we've sort of learned over the years that they're just not that efficient at delivering at the end of the day the number of housing units that we need to move the needle on affordability. So I don't want to say that these programs don't work. I want to say that it depends on how you define working. I think when we look at creating housing year over year in Dallas, using some of these programs in the 3,000-4,000 unit type of range, when you have the need for maybe 50,000, 60,000 or so units, it's just not enough. And so I think what I want to emphasize to the committee, and I definitely appreciate the opportunity to be here to speak to this, is it's not about the fact that these existing programs are unable to create a housing start. It's about the fact that they will never be as effective at creating the housing at scale that we need to actually move affordability in the right direction, but then actually impacting the supply side.
I agree with you, and I think there's unanimity here in this room that we need to make sure that we're sending those signals and trying to address the supply side. I guess what I'm trying to think through is how do we make sure that as we spur building and development that we're spurring diversity of types of homes that are being built, because we struggle with that here in New Jersey, my home state, where a lot of the incentives for building is to build very large houses and very expensive condos, and not as much on the affordability side. So I was just trying to get a sense from you, like, what are the tools that can make sure that affordable homes are being built and not just some of the most expensive stock.
Right. Well, again, I think this is where I have a philosophical difference with some folks about whether or not you can just set out to build an affordable home without getting involved in the market in ways that are counterproductive. I do think that the affordability of homes is related to the supply and demand issue. And what I would say in a city like Dallas, which is almost 400 square miles, which has some more vacant land in it to build on than most American cities have available to it, is that we are not utilizing to the full extent that we can just building. I'd say let's start with single family. We could be building a lot more single family that would drive down the cost of housing for everyone. Without setting out from the outset and trying to artificially cap the cost of it and saying, this will only be, we'll only let someone charge someone X amount of dollars to pay for a house like this. I don't think that those types of programs work long term. At some point, the house turns over and it stops being an affordable house, even if you set out from the outset for it to be one. The only thing that works long term, I truly believe at this point, having lived this now, is to have a build, baby, build attitude towards housing in your town. We're being inundated by Californians and Chicagoans in Dallas, people who are coming because we're being economically successful. And it looks like a bargain to them, all of our housing stock, but it's driving up the median cost for people who are not used to paying that. And I think that the approach we need to take is one that is more market-based and that unleashes the potential of the private sector to build more on our unused land, which there's a lot of.
Great. Thank you, Mayor. I yield back.
Thank you, sir. Next will be Senator Realms.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, thank you to all of you for coming and visiting with us today. I think the one thing that we hear time and again, regardless of if you're a large community or small community, is the need for appropriate housing. And in many cases, it can take a different form or a different priority, regardless, depending upon whether you're in a small community or a large community. But at the federal level, we need to be able to look at multiple types of programs that might be available to assist in incentivizing the development of new housing. Housing eventually wears out, and you've got to be looking towards the future. I'd like to begin with Ms. Willis. First of all, thank you for the work to help the people with the lowest incomes have the opportunity for quality and affordable homes in our communities. The last several years, I've focused on bipartisan housing work addressing a range of topics, including the streamlining of the environmental review process, modifying homelessness prevention programs, and increase access to affordable housing in rural areas. For the past two Congresses, Senator Smith and I have introduced the Rural Housing Service Reform Act to preserve affordable housing units in rural communities across the country and make much-needed updates to the USDA's Rural Housing Service. My question for you is that with your work with the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, how could legislation like the Rural Housing Service Reform Act make a difference in rural communities and their ability to finance affordable housing?
Thank you for the question, Senator. It is extremely important to ensure that we have affordable housing in rural communities. We talked a bit today about suburban and urban communities and tribal communities as well, but it is important to make sure that we focus on urban communities. We know that some of the challenges that are faced in rural communities are severe in terms of the building of affordable housing. Sometimes it's much harder to build in rural communities. Sometimes the wages are for the people in rural communities are lower. And what we have is really, when we talk about an affordable housing crisis, in nationwide, 1 out of 4 people who are eligible for affordable housing get affordable housing or rental assistance of some kind. Another way of saying that is 3 out of 4 don't. And so I think in terms of if we're looking at the demand side, really it's making sure that the federal government invests and have resources for communities, including rural communities, to make sure that they also have that the housing, that it's deeply targeted. And so if we're talking about building affordable housing, we're talking about ensuring that if a builder is building in a rural community, that they're using USDA funds or they're using low-income housing tax credits, but maybe even pairing that with home dollars or with the housing trust fund dollars.
I think some rural housing, it's different in some cases than some of the urban housing challenges, but once again, you have fewer contractors, and the contractors that are there may build fewer homes as well in those rural areas. Just curious, excuse me, who are going to be the individuals hit hardest by the expiring USDA mortgages, and what could that mean for available workforce housing? I mean, it sounds like a weird offset, but literally, as these mortgages expire, things happen to those programs. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, they do. And so what's happening is that as the USDA mortgages are expiring, also a lot of times they're paired with subsidies. So we want to make sure that the families and individuals who are living in the homes or where the mortgages are expiring, that they can continue to use those subsidies. So it's really kind of decoupling.
That needs to be done.
That's right, absolutely, to ensure that people can stay housed because it's important. These are mortgages after 20, 30 years where we want to be able to keep them in the housing stock because if not, landlords can raise the rents, can take them out of the stock, can do all sorts of things, right?
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Dr. Glazier, just a real quick thought. CDBGs are really important, and we use that in a lot of cases to determine infrastructure opportunities in small and rural communities. One challenge, though, is that in order to do a lot of those types of things, you've got to be able to identify the environmental review processes, but also the Davis-Bacon prevailing wage requirements. If I remember correctly, utilizing a $2,000 CDBG in a local community in a project that would require following Davis-Bacon requirements. That includes prevailing wage compliance, weekly certified payroll reporting, on-site labor interviews, contractor documentation, and administrative oversight. I guess my question very quickly is wouldn't it cost more than $2,000 in administrative costs just to complete the Davis-Bacon reporting alone?
That certainly sounds like a lot of work, Senator. And I think while most of the regulations that we're talking about are local, I am certainly on board for a reducing the federal regulatory burden as well agenda.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Rounds. Senator Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member, and thanks to all of our panelists today. Let me just start by saying I appreciate the line of questioning that my friend and colleague, Senator Rounds from South Dakota, was just offering on our bill. Mr. Chair, I would say that I heard you say earlier that housing should be a nonpartisan issue, and I appreciate that. And I think that the bill that Senator Rounds and I have been working on with regard to rural housing actually completely fits that mold. It is not a bill. It is not a bill that is pushing any partisan interest. It is a bill that is really focused on protecting and preserving affordable housing that without which in rural communities people are literally not going to have a place to live. So I'm going to just follow up a bit on my colleague Senator Rounds' questions, Ms. Willis, if I could. And forgive me if I'm repeating because I was in transit as he was asking his questions, but who are the folks that are living in these rural housing service homes? Like who are we making sure have a roof over their heads and a safe place to call home with this program?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Senator. So we're talking about individuals and families who earn 30% AMI or less, or at the poverty line. So that's who we're talking about. And these are people who need stable, affordable homes.
So some of them are working families.
Very much so.
Many of them are already working. They're just working in low-wage jobs, or they might be elders, right?
Absolutely, and that's what we're seeing. A lot of the people that we're talking about are people in the workforce, as you mentioned, with low-paying jobs. We're also talking, and this is maybe a third, when we're talking about ELI, extremely low-income individuals. individuals. We're talking about, again, 30% or less AMI. We're talking about 30% of them, or 1/3, I should say, who are in the workforce, and maybe another third are our seniors, and another third students, or maybe people with disabilities, and also single caregivers.
Caregivers,
as
right.
well.
Right, thank you. I think that that's important because a lot of times we don't really think about who exactly we are making sure have a safe place to call home with these, with this effort. And could you just comment briefly on how important it is to, and we talk about adding affordable places for people to live, a housing supply problem, but I think we don't talk often enough about how we need to preserve the housing that we have so that it doesn't go away, exacerbating the challenges that we have.
Right, that's right. And that would certainly exacerbate the challenge because, again, in terms of with these we're talking about rural communities and these expiring USDA mortgages. We want to be able to keep a housing stock affordable to people with the lowest incomes. And I know that your bill, the Rural Housing Services Reform Act, it really allows households to continue to receive rental assistance, even when those property mortgages mature. And so that's important. And so that's about the preservation of housing. And so that's why a bill like the Rural Housing Service Reform Act is critical to these communities.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Dr. Glazer, I wanted to talk with you a bit about the challenges that we have in helping to increase the supply of housing. I actually think this is another place where Democrats and Republicans agree that I think Ranking Member Warren made this point in her opening comments that if you have an imbalance between demand and supply, prices are going to go up, and that's going to create the problems that we have here. And I'm very proud that my hometown of Minneapolis has tackled some of the zoning reforms that are necessary to make it easier to build housing, all different kinds of housing to address the challenges that we have. So could you just talk a little bit about how you see this, how you see this issue and what we should be paying attention to, and maybe just a bit on how we can innovate in the way that we build housing?
Thank you, Senator. That's a great question. And I think I want to use this opportunity to say a word for modular housing.
Yes.
In fact, we have modular housing has lots of capacity to be attractive. It can be differentiated. We can do lots of great things with it, and we can do it cheaply. Economists since Adam Smith have known that mass production is a critical path towards affordability. And yet we make it extraordinarily difficult to mass-produced housing, both because of local zoning rules and because of HUD regulations. Both of them are at play. The chairman of the Illinois Housing Authority is working to make sure that public housing in the city of Chicago is actually built using modular housing, which I think is an exciting move. Yep. I would love to see a state that decided to champion, statewide zoning. So if you have 1,000 square foot hut, you can put the following 4 models of modular housing down. I would love to see something that sort of enabled scale economies yet again in housing. And getting back to Senator Kim's question earlier about housing for poor people, modular housing provides an amazingly good way of providing starter homes and sort of easy-to-buy things for people who are not of extravagant means.
Our Public Housing Authority in Minneapolis has been using modular housing to build scattered site housing in neighborhoods, thanks to the new zoning laws that we have that are less expensive, they're high quality, and the construction can be completed in roughly 75% of the time, which also then helps to reduce costs.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
On behalf of the chairman, Senator Ricketts.
Thank you, and I want to thank Chairman Scott and Ranking Member Warren for having this important hearing today because, as I think we all recognize, the housing shortage in our country is something that is creating problems in all of our communities across the state, across this country. And in my state of Nebraska, that's certainly one of the things. We talked a lot about rural housing, and that's one of the things that we worked on when I was governor of Nebraska and had success in coming up with programs to be able to do it. And certainly we heard the stories, and maybe some of you have heard it in your states, and Senator Rounds in South Dakota, where we'll have somebody in a small town be offered a job to move to that small town, and they come and can't find a house that's suitable, and so they turn the job offer down, and that is a big hamper to our rural communities growing. So being able to cut through the red tape, come up with some of the solutions is one of the things that I think is important for us to take a look at. In Nebraska, we created a rural workforce housing bill, which provides $7 million to start with, that was available for communities to apply for this grant. And then the way most communities end up using it was creating this grant to basically create a revolving fund so that developers would be able to get a low-interest loan to be able to come to a rural community and build houses that would then be available for that community and then repay that loan so it could go back to the community and be loaned out to the next developer down the line. And as I said, this was tremendously successful. And to your point, Dr. Glazer, one of the things that it's allowed, for example, is developers in our, can make more money maybe in our bigger cities, but wouldn't want to come to a community because it was too expensive. They would actually be able to find it would be economically viable and build, say, 12 homes at once to be able to get more toward that mass scale and be able to bring down the cost of the home. So, for example, in Central City, a developer was able to build a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house, 1,380 square feet, on the market right now for $209,000. So very affordable to be able to get people into those homes so that people could take the jobs in our rural communities. I just talked to the mayor of Ralston, Nebraska. They're using our middle-income housing fund, which we developed as a follow-on, to be able to build a 120-unit apartment complex. So same kind of idea, though, grant programs, refundable, revolving funds, essentially. Now, we also used ARPA dollars to be able to help do this, but the ARPA dollars had to be one-time used. And so the problem with the federal dollars is they were too restrictive. And so we couldn't use them in the same way, so it's a one-time shot, which was nice, but it's not creating long-lasting value. Anyway, Dr. Glazer, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about some of your research on some of the things because we're talking about creating more supply. First of all, University of Chicago, great school. I'm an alum, so great job getting your PhD there. You talked about the zoning and how that is impacting the cost because we're restricting what the land use can be for. And studies have shown up to 24% of the cost of a new home could be that zoning requirement. What about some of the other things? The ranking member mentioned, for example, building permits. Or what about just the availability of finding people who can do the job in the first place? Shortage of people in the trades. Have you done any research or seen any research that talks about those sorts of problems and what we might be able to do to address them? Microphone.
That great question. Let me differentiate between the two ideas that you put forward. First of all, permits are a local government issue. They're really important. Time to permit is really important. I think the sort of nudging against local legislation that we've been discussing would be helpful with those as well. If we put an expectation that states are going to have to build in their most productive counties in order to have access to certain discretionary spending, those local counties are going to have to figure out how to get their permitting faster, right? They're going to have to move themselves down from a 7-year process. The workforce is different. I think that there is a role at particularly the state and local level, but I'd be open for a federal program if it were well constructed to do more vocational training for lots of places in the U.S. I think in many cases, sort of smart vocational training that wraps around existing education provides an exciting option. But again, I'd like to see that legislation in place before I endorse it. I'd like to know how much money we're talking about, and I'd like to see evaluation of the programs. Part of the beauty of vocational training is you can pay for performance. You don't need to pay the person unless they've actually learned how to become a plumber, learned to become a programmer. There is a question as to whether or not something about the global financial crisis permanently broke the construction industry. I don't believe that. It is true that we're down about 200,000 people as a whole, but we're up 100,000 in remodeling. So in some sense, what excessive regulation has done is we've changed us from being a nation of builders to being a nation of remodelers, because the permitting process is easy for remodelers. But in the cities that build, like, for example, Dallas, Texas, they're right back where they were before the global financial crisis. So I think it is possible to get the people back. But again, as a strategy to think about in a holistic human capital strategy, thinking about a little bit more in vocational training, I think that's worth doing.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Glazer. Yield back.
Thank you, Senator Reed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your testimony. Ms. Willis, back in 2008, I helped create the Housing Trust Fund, which is designed, as you know, to expand housing for people who can desperately looking for housing. do you think today the Housing Trust Fund is necessary, and how does it help low-income Americans?
Thank you for the question, and also thank you for your leadership in creating the National Housing Trust Fund. The National Housing Trust Fund it's incredibly important because it's one of the only federal investments that goes deep in terms of its target to target extremely low-income households. So again, that's households that are at 30% AMI or poverty line. And so it's extremely important because without that, it's can be very difficult to create affordable housing for that population. But the Housing Trust Fund targets deeply. And so affordable housing providers and developers are able to build affordable housing using those funds that go to their states. So it's critically important to have that level of deepness, if you will, to really target the households that really need it. Affordable housing.
As you probably know, we've put in legislation that would expand the resources of the trust fund to reach, we hope, 3 million affordable homes. And I think, again, everyone on the table has said demand is one of the key constraints, and this would really accelerate demand. So I hope we can make some progress on that. There's another program that I think is very useful, and I'm very proud to have joined Senator Britt, my colleague from Alabama, to introduce the Helping More Families Save Act. And essentially, that's the Family Self-Sufficiency Program. And I've seen the results myself. We're meeting families who, because of this program, they can put money away, save it up, and eventually move out and move up. And we hope that we can get this passed this year. So have you seen evidence of that program and how well it works?
Oh, absolutely. And so we certainly do support and have supported the Helping More Families Save Act. And again, thank you for your leadership on that as well. Because it is important for, it essentially helps renters living in HUD-assisted housing to save more of their hard-earned income to boost their financial stability. And so we've seen it help countless families across the country. But it really just helps families, to save more rather than paying those higher rents. They can put the extra payments into an escrow account that they can use, for mobility or to invest in their future.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Glasser, Senator Loomis and I have another piece of legislation, which is the Property Improvement in Manufactured Homes Loan Monetization Act. But it would help families access financing for manufactured housing. And could you just generally give us an idea about how manufactured housing and ADUs support housing supply and affordability?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question, Senator. Yes, ADUs are one way in which communities that are averse to sort of large-scale projects can still densify. And if you ask me, I tend to wish that we do more than just add ADUs, but ADUs are a potential aid, and manufactured housing is just a really inexpensive way to add an ADU to your property. And so I think policies that lean in again towards modular, towards manufactured housing are helpful on this, precisely because ADUs are the one policy that can get through in some of our most hostile environments.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Reid, thanks for being a good example of that nonpartisan approach with Senator Britt on so many important issues impacting everyday Americans.
Well,
I'm just sad that you're not working with me yet, but next time we'll do it.
If you want to get something done, you find a very talented woman, and we have them right here.
We have lots of them. Yeah. Our committee's full of them. Yes. Senator Britt.
I am really appreciative to Senator Reid for his willingness to tackle these tough issues and do it in a bipartisan way that we can actually achieve results for the American people. So thank you, Senator Reid, for your leadership. Thank you all for being here. This is certainly an important topic. I am particularly looking forward to hearing more about this as the chair of the Housing Subcommittee. You know, when I tackled this issue, first off, getting here, it's clearly an issue of supply and demand. It's also it encumbers a lot more than that. You know, when we started looking at regulations, knowing that about 25% of a new home cost is directly attributed to regulation, you think what is necessary and what is overburdensome. When you find out that, you know, Americans are no longer buying their first home, that piece of the American dream, in their late 20s, but rather in their late 30s, early 40s, if then can they achieve that? How do we make this more obtainable for every American? There's a number of approaches. Senator Reid mentioned the one that we had, of government assistance programs that will help people actually achieve upward mobility, that will help them stand on their own 2 feet and be able to live their version of the American dream, which is so critically important. But there are other things that we've been doing that we feel like can kind of claw back on some of this stuff. You know, environmental regulations under NEPA have directly stifled housing supply. When we look at Alabama, we have a great example. I loved hearing what Senator Ricketts was saying of things that they were doing in Nebraska. In Alabama, we have a great example through our fortified roof program. It incentivizes strong home building, and it's able to do that, you know, encouraging people to build homes that will withstand storms, obviously without exposing or imposing excessive environmental standards in the process. It has been a win-win and has been wildly successful. So there's certainly a way to do both, and there's a balance that needs to be achieved. Mr. Glacier, can you speak to the impact of erroneous environmental and land use regulations and the ability to build homes to meet those demands?
Thank you, Senator, and thank you for your leadership on this topic. It is an odd irony that often environmental regulations are counterproductive environmentally. So about 15 years ago, I wrote a paper with California environmental economist Matthew Kahn, currently at the University of Southern California, which tried to measure the carbon emissions associated with building in different parts of the country. We did this whole normalizing for family size, normalizing for income. We found, unsurprisingly, that by far the lowest carbon emission parts of the country, naturally, were coastal California. Nothing to do with the regulation. It's the weather, just to be entirely clear. It's Januaries that don't require you to heat like crazy, and it's Julys that don't require you to air condition, okay? If you cared about reducing America's carbon emissions, you should then be saying, let's build on the California, in San Francisco Bay. Let's add in as much housing as we possibly can. And yet California housing, partially because of the famous Friends of Mammoth case, which requires a significant environmental review locally for any California project, right? They face the most onerous environmental regulations possible. And the effect of that is moving building from places where it is good for the environment to being places where it is less good to the environment. And you see that happen over and over again. And partially it's a mistake that regulators make, that they think they're actually stopping the building. But it doesn't stop the building. It just moves it someplace else, and it moves it to a place that is worse for the environment.
No, I appreciate that, and I have a couple more follow-up questions on that.
Absolutely.
I would love to submit for the record for you if that's okay, because I want to dig down on that. I am short on time. Mayor Johnson, I heard you say to Chair Scott, talked about a little bit of the local challenges that are occurring. I am a big believer that the best thing that the federal government can do in most situations is just get out of the way. As the daughter of 2 small business owners, I saw that firsthand. I think local leaders know best, their boots on the ground, and local solutions work best for the people they serve. Can you talk briefly about how we are ensuring, how we enable and equip our state and local leaders to meet the unique challenges that their communities face, or what we can do better in that regard?
I appreciate that question, Senator, and I will tell you, it's interesting. We look to Washington for a couple things at the local level. One, you all figured out, it's money, right? We always are looking for money from Washington. But the other thing is leadership and thought leadership. And sometimes, being so close to the people, it's good. You know exactly what's going on, but it can be noisy. Sometimes the folks who are a little further away can look at a problem and see it nationally. And if you don't look at this housing issue nationally, you won't understand what's really going on. At the city level, we are competing with our other cities for people, institutional investment. We want corporate relocations. We want jobs. We want higher education institutions. We're competing for those things. So as a mayor, my job is to try to make Dallas as awesome as it can be, and make the quality of life as high as it can be. The result of that, when I'm successful, is pressure on my housing market, because we're not building enough houses, new ones, to add to the housing stock fast enough. The new folks are just adding pressure to the market in the form of more demand in terms of people and what they're willing to pay for it. They're more well compensated. Again, like I said, they're coming from the coast, and our housing market looks like a bargain to them. So what we need from, I'm saying this over and over again because I was very honored to be asked to be here today. We need the understanding of Congress that this is a problem that has to be attacked nationally, because we're just pushing the issue around. We really do need to have a build, baby, build approach to housing. And in addition to the leadership, that we were looking for from our friends here in Washington, it's not always about coming and asking for money per se in the form of a new program, but there are ways that, and it's above my pay grade, I'll let all of these wonderful pieces of legislation I'm hearing about figure out how to incent us to do what is within our purview. I would be run out of any room back home or in any group of mayors if I didn't say that we do believe that the zoning issues, the process and permitting issues are going to always be best handled at the local level. That does not mean, though, that you cannot attach, as I believe Senator Kennedy was implying, you cannot attach benefits to us doing things better in the right way. If you want to reward a city that reduces their permitting time and builds X, housing units per year that at a goal, at a rate that you set, I'm all for that. Dallas will jump in that competition. We would gladly enter that competition to increase our housing starts to attract some sort of federal benefit. But it's not a new program we're looking for. It's a change in the narrative.
Absolutely. Well, Mr. Chair, thank you. I have a question for Mr. Jelinek, and I will submit that for the record. I've run out of time. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Warner.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing, and to the panel and the mayor. I'm going to incorporate by reference what everybody has said about housing shortage and all the things we need to do. I want to quickly go through, so I can get to questions, my litany of some of the tools, Mr. Mayor, that I think, and almost all of these are bipartisan. New market tax credit extension with Senator Daines, Neighborhood Home Investment Act. This is the fill-in opportunity from the Dallases to almost every community. We've got to make sure that if there's aging properties, they can be filled in at a cost-effective basis. Historic tax credit in terms of rural applications, and the traditional tax credit as well. And I know CDFI tax credit, and I'm going to come to that with Ms. Willis in a moment. I also want to advertise for particularly my Republican colleagues something we put together last year called the LIFT Act, which would be focused on first-generation, first-time home buyers, which by definition ends up being two-thirds people of color. And the subsidy comes in the form, and I'm going to come to you, Mr. Glazer, on this one, that says, in addition to some of the other tools, if you qualify, you would get you'd pay a 30-year rate, but you get a 20-year mortgage. So you double the amount of equity you get in the first 10 years. And I think the ranking member's already mentioned this. Something I've been doing on CDFIs about trying to make sure we get a secondary market. So why don't I start, Mr. Glazer, with you on, on LIFT. I was going to go to Mr. Jelinek. Could you speak to that idea of how we can try to deal with not just racial wealth gap, but the ability for first-time home buyers to build up equity with something innovative like the LIFT program?
Senator Warner, thank you for the question. I am a little familiar with the LIFT Act, and I understand exactly as you explained it, where the consumer would get the benefit of a 30-year rate, but essentially have the ability to build equity as if it was a 20-year mortgage. I think we would really like to dig into this with you and it's products like this that get us excited. That again, whether it's a product like this or something else, it's delivered without increasing risk or ability to repay, which this doesn't do either of those, and gets people on that path of achieving the American dream and getting that equity in their homes. I would love to explore further, but yeah, we would definitely be supportive of something like that.
And I will go to Mr. Glazer, which is I think, again, lots of people have talked about the
the need to have more incentives for localities to improve their zoning tools. I've got two notional ideas, and I do think potentially the CDBG grants having a carrot to maybe even increase those if you would limit your zoning requirements. One is commercial to residential. There's not a community in America that doesn't have an aging strip mall of one form or another. I don't think they're ever going to come back. You've already got infrastructure built in. How we could use that tool, but to really incent those conversions, number one. And then number two, and I think some other folks may have raised this, but how we can actually work with religious institutions. I mean, lots of churches, synagogues, mosques who have lots of available land. I've got in Northern Virginia a church that's been trying for 5 years to put a multifamily unit, and it would not disrupt the neighborhood, but it's 5 years is way too long, and they've not moved a shovel of dirt. So can you talk about, beyond CDBG, what other tools we might use to try to give incentives to localities that change their zoning restrictions?
These are great questions, Senator. And let me just join with you in a profound desire to see those single-use zoning rules that were imposed throughout America starting in the 1920s, see them repealed back. Now, they have to be repealed back at the local level, not at the federal level. But this is a tremendous curse, and it's a curse for cities that are trying to reinvent themselves post-COVID, especially those cities that have huge individual office markets. It's a curse for suburban areas that have strip malls that were once the cutting edge of retail and are now not there anymore. So I think thinking about this is great. Again, I would probably push on something which is sort of, again, using some form of carrots and sticks with federal funding to just nudge more production, but maybe a specific discussion of how great it would be to sort of allow different uses of land. I think that would be very helpful.
Well, and I did, again, to my colleagues on both sides, we're doing some of this in Virginia, but need to do much more. There are so many religious institutions, and with that contribution, you take out the cost of the underlying land. So there's a win-win here, and I think an interesting partnership. Ms. Willis, in the last couple of seconds, CDFIs, you and I visited on this in the past. Important niche. We need to give these additional benefits. We actually, frankly, need more. Under the last administration, we got $12 billion in Tier 1 equity and grants, but we need more deposits. So can you talk for a few seconds about the CDFI?
Sure. Thank you, Senator. So CDFIs are important. They offer flexible loans to build and preserve affordable housing for rental homes, for healthcare clinics, grocery stores, things that the communities need, schools, and so forth. But they also play an important role in expanding economic opportunity and development in distressed communities. And they offer interest rates that are flexible, that are better, that have a better reach for underserved communities as well. And through the Capital Magnet Fund, CDFIs they financed over 83,000 affordable homes. So it's extremely important, the role that CDFIs play.
Good. Thank you.
Senator Moreno.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this very important hearing. Generally speaking, I'll ask some questions, but I think it's important to say that if government action and good intentions lowered housing costs, and you looked over the last period of time, housing should be free, given how many initiatives government has put in place to lower housing costs, not ironically. Dr. Glazer, you live in Massachusetts. I lived in Massachusetts for 12 years. It's more rare to find a Republican at Harvard than it is to find a Republican writ large in Massachusetts. And the ranking member talked about how housing costs for that school teacher, I'm very familiar with that. I ran a large group of car dealerships that sold cars to school teachers, and they kept living further and further away from Massachusetts, to the point where a lot of people lived in New Hampshire that worked in Massachusetts. And it's interesting because I think if you're looking at how do you solve housing problems, I would headline it as do the opposite of Massachusetts, which is massive government intervention in public markets, private markets that should be allowed to work. My question for you, Dr. Glazer, is this. In 2019, if you made $59,000 a year, you could afford a home as defined by your income was less than 30% of your mortgage payment. Today, that number is almost approaching $110,000. Just 5 years. What happened?
Well, thank you for your question. Thank you for your care on this topic. I want to just first respond to your comment on Massachusetts land use regulations, which is I have long thought it's deeply ironic that red state Texas does such a better job of providing affordable housing for ordinary people than blue state Massachusetts does. And I think it is exactly the issue of local land use regulation, all of which is very well intentioned, all of which had consequences that were deeply harmful for ordinary people trying to buy homes. The change in affordability reflects two things, right? It reflects both the price of housing and the mortgage rates. And I'm not a banking or a macroeconomist. I study housing markets. I study cities and other places. So I'm not going to run down the litany of mistakes that my macroeconomist colleagues think that got us into the point where mortgage rates are currently what they are. That's not my business. But that is a big part of it. The other part of it that I am happy to talk about is the fact that housing is so much more expensive than it should be. And I think this is an issue in which it used to be about coastal areas. And now it is increasingly in Sunbelt cities where the inner ring areas have made it harder and harder to build. And you used to see patterns in places like Atlanta where we built much more in the pricier parts of Atlanta in the 1970s and 1980s. Now we don't. Now we build in the lower density areas that are away from things. And so I think this is no longer just a Massachusetts issue. And that's in some sense what scares me about it, is the places that were the escape valves for affordable housing in the U.S., the Houstons, the Atlantas, the Miamis, they're not turning into escape valves anymore. And that just scares me. And that's why I think having some national discussion, having some, even if it is largely symbolic, is just really important to recognize that we're going in the wrong direction as a country if we want to be a place where outsiders can come and forge a brighter future.
Yeah, I mean, when you see an 80% increase in an income requirement over a 5-year period of time to afford a home, you got to look at it and say, what happened during that 4 or 5 year period? Could it be that we let 10 million illegals come into this country? I mean, would that incredible surge in demand with no correlating supply increase, could that have something to do with it? Do those 10 million people have to be having to be housed raise the price of housing generally?
So again, I'm not an expert on immigration policy in any way.
But you know supply and demand 101. I assume that's a criteria for becoming a Harvard professor.
Indeed. I think I'm just going to repeat what I said in my original testimony, which is we know things are a demand problem when you see quantities and prices both up. You know things are a supply problem when you see prices up and quantities down. What we have seen in the U.S. over the last 15 years is prices are way up and building quantities are way down. And that is why I think it is crucial. Like the one fact to take away from this is a supply problem. It is fundamentally not about housing demand.
Well, again, 10 million people that need to be housed is a problem. Mr. Jelinek, on the mortgage world, because this is also the Banking and Housing Committee, what are some things that you think could be done from an innovation perspective to help alleviate this problem?
Senator, thank you for the question. It's sort of the mirror image of the discussion we've been having on housing, just applied to the mortgage side of it, right? There's as long as we are careful with the innovations we implement and the ways we test them, there are a lot of ways we can use new technology and big data to reduce some costs in the process. So I could go into those if you'd like.
Yep, please.
Certainly. So, whether it's, and some of this was in my testimony, and these are just some examples, right? But I guess I'll give about 10 seconds on the core of our business. I mean, we exclusively work with independent mortgage brokers that are small town businesses across all 50 states. The reason why we are dedicated to serving the wholesale channel and working with mortgage brokers only is because they are generally the lowest cost way for a consumer to get a loan. And they're embedded in their communities, and whether it's rural, whether it's urban, they know the market better than anyone else. So our whole existence is about being a low-cost provider. You can even see that we're a public company in our margins compared to some of our competitors that have a different business model. So everything we do is about technology and process and efficiency. So some of the things that we have now available to us, we have incredible data and analytics tools in the appraisal realm. There's more data now that Freddie and Fannie have, and there's more tools that we have where we might be able to increase accuracy of appraisals and reduce costs of appraisals. And it's a small number relative to some of the housing supply issues we're talking about, but these numbers start to add up. I could say the same thing for the mortgage insurance or the title space, and these are all areas where they're very necessary. But if you start to look at premiums collected, and ultimately when the premiums need to be paid out, there are opportunities to provide alternatives where you don't have any, don't increase the systemic risk, don't increase lender risk, don't increase consumer risk, but you're just leveraging modern day technology and innovation, in some cases even AI, to just reduce cost out of what is a complicated and often legacy oriented process, the mortgage process.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Oh, he's gone.
Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, and thank all of you for your testimony. Let me just start on the supply issue, and I've been listening in on C-SPAN, and clearly constrained supply drives up costs, right? You're an economist, Dr. Glazer, right? But the reason we're worried about constrained supply is because with demand not being met, it drives up costs. That's the fundamental question, right? So there's another side to the cost factor, and that is the cost of materials, right? And so I just want to read to everybody a letter that we all received from the National Association of Home Builders very recently. And I'm quoting, "While home building is inherently domestic, builders rely on components produced abroad, with Canada and Mexico representing nearly 25% of building materials imports. Imposing additional tariffs on these imports will lead to higher material costs, which will ultimately be passed on to home buyers in the form of increased housing prices," unquote. That's a pretty simple statement of supply and demand, is it not, Doctor? Yes, Senator. Right. So, when we hear the president, talking about beautiful tariffs, I think the American people need to understand what he's talking about, if applied in a broad-based way, mean higher housing costs. Isn't that right, Doctor?
It is hard to see how imposing higher costs on materials coming from outsiders is going to lower costs for housing. That is certainly true, Senator.
Well, let me give you the estimate from the chief economist over at the National Association of Home Builders, Robert Dietz. He estimates the tariffs, once fully phased in, will add anywhere from $7,500 to $10,000 to the cost of building the average American family home. Do you have any reason to dispute that?
Well, it is true that he represents an industry group, and industry groups are known to talk about policies in a way that gets the policy objective that they want. But no, I have no particular evidence on the home building technology that would lead me to dispute that number.
Thank you. Ms. Willis, I want to turn a little bit to the other part of the equation, and that is, trying to help families that can't afford a home some additional means to be able to do that. And in your testimony, you talk about, quote, the immediate threat facing HUD as a result of the actions being taken by Elon Musk and the Doge group. I must say that I find it kind of sickening that the richest man in the world, who just a few years ago sold like 7 mansions, is trying to deny working people access to programs that, at least to some extent, increase affordability. Could you talk about the damage that would be done if the threatened cuts go forward?
Absolutely, Senator. And also, too, just thinking about, you're talking about the richest man in the world, and I want to talk about the HUD programs and who they're meant for. Because when we're talking about ELI, extremely low-income households, we did a study, and we have a study that's called Out of Reach. And so $32.11 is what a person needs to make in order to afford a modest 2-bedroom unit. $26.74 is what a person would need to make to afford a modest 1-bedroom unit. As we know, the federal the wage is $7.25. And so many people will have to work 2.8 jobs or more in order to afford affordable housing. HUD provides affordable housing and stability to people, who need it across this country. At least 1 out of 4 people who need it across this country. Again, that means 3 out of 4 don't receive it. So when we're talking about the cuts to HUD, we're talking about in one program, the program that oversees the field offices, we're talking about a 50% cut. a 50% cut in staff to the program that oversees public housing and Indian affairs. We're talking about an 84% cut to the office that oversees CDBG, block grants, the Housing Trust Fund, you name it. So we're talking about an 84% cut there, and a 76% cut to the program that does the research, so that figures out the market rates and the rents that are to be paid to landlords. So how can these programs function if you're cutting these programs? And again, it's a significant cut throughout HUD. The field offices, they see people on the front line that are coming to them to access HUD programs. And I don't see how you can function as an organization with those kinds of significant cuts.
Thank you. And just in closing, I don't have any more questions. I just want to thank you for supporting in your testimony the bipartisan legislation I've introduced with Senator Young entitled the Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act, a proven approach to helping lift families out of the cycle of poverty. Thank you.
Senator Tillis?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. Several years ago, when I was in the state legislature, I had one of the towns in my district ask for a 1-hour meeting. I've told this story, I think, in finance hearing before. We spent 45 minutes in that meeting talking about what I could do to help them with affordable housing. And we had a great meeting. The last 15 minutes of the meeting, they were trying to pitch me on passing, we have what they call local bills, where it provides authority for county and city governments to do things that are unique to them. They wanted me to file a local bill that empowered them to mandate sprinkler systems in single-family dwellings. And I said, guys, we just spent 45 minutes talking about what we can do for more affordable housing, and you've just proposed something as a mandate that would add to the cost of a home about 10 or 15%. How do those two work together? And they don't. North Carolina, I think, is tied or close to Idaho, or tied with Idaho, for having the most number of residential construction permits authorized per 1,000 people at 9.12 a year. And yet, over the next 5 years, we're going to have about 800,000 unit shortfall, almost evenly divided between rental and for sale units. One of the things I didn't accomplish when I was Speaker of the House that I hope we get to accomplish up here is that the scarce dollars for affordable housing resources only go to the state and local governments that are regulating efficiently and responsibly. Why would Dr. Glazer, I've got a question for you. What is wrong with this idea that says that we index states and local governments based on regulatory execution, cost to permit and time to permit? And at some point, when they reach an unacceptable level, they are no longer eligible for affordable housing resources coming from the federal government, because in a world of scarce resources, we should deploy it to jurisdictions that fall below that unacceptable level. What's wrong with a construct like that?
So, Senator, as I argued in my testimony, I believe strongly that the best path forward is to use some form of discretionary federal spending to nudge states and localities to permit more housing. And some form of conditionality of this form seems helpful. I think you have to make the decision of what forms of spending you would want. In my own thinking, I'm certainly open on housing, but if you actually wanted to move a state, let's say California, towards changing their rules, I think you'd find transportation spending would be much more effective than housing spending, because in fact, housing spending is just going to appeal much less to the typical legislator in California, which is hence the need for different committees to talk to one another. But some degree of leaning against the highly restrictive areas is really, I think, the right thing to do.
It reminds me of the debate we're having about salt. I have people wanting me to provide relief to states that overtax their population. They want the federal government to subsidize that, to kind of discount their overtaxation. Think about the same jurisdictions. They're the salt states. The reason I have a personal problem with that is that if North Carolina had not lowered its tax burden when I was Speaker, we would be a salt state. Well, similarly, why on earth should we not hold state and local governments accountable for the increasing cost of affordable housing units in their districts? Leave it up to them. If you want to regulate till the cows come home, great. In the same way salt steaks, if you want to keep on raising taxes, awesome. Just make sure that you do it to a level to where you can get reelected and don't expect federal dollars to throw good money after bad. What's wrong with that concept?
Senator, for 25 years, I have been obsessed with local regulation, making it too difficult for ordinary Americans to buy a home, buy and rent a home. I am thrilled that the members of this committee are actually taking this seriously and actually thinking about having federal policies that could meaningfully lean against this. I will give one caveat, if I may. Like, it's got to be based on the production of units.
Got it.
Don't make it based on the rules, because they can monkey with the rules any way you want.
Got it. That's why I want to finish with a question of Ms. Willis. And because I like the idea of Tillis asking Willis, too. But Ms. Willis, why shouldn't reducing, or is, let me position it a different way. Does your coalition focus on unnecessary regulatory requirements as to the extent that you could measure them in areas that you're focused on, as a key priority for your organization to make sure that we can produce more affordable housing? Do you do that today, and how do you react to what I've just asked Mr. Glazer? And then I'm done after that, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator. And Tillis Willis sounds like a great television show. But I will say that we focus on, because we do see the affordable housing crisis as being two-pronged. So it's on the supply side that we don't have enough affordable housing that we talked about today. But it's also on the demand side, because incomes, there's a gap between incomes and rent. And so I do see that the federal government can assist in making sure that, in making investments in rental assistance to people who need it. Because again, only 1 out of 4 receive it, but we should have universal rental assistance.
That's a fair point.
But
I'm telling you, it would be helpful for people who are advocating for housing to understand that this is an impediment. This is a driver behind some of the assistance that people need, because we are needlessly increasing the cost, creating a greater gap. People that grew up in the same trailer park as I did need help, get it. But let's figure out how to make that trailer park, and those apartments more affordable. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yes, sir. Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Scott, and to our ranking member for holding this hearing. I so appreciate it. This is such an issue, as you can only imagine and hear right now across the country, including in Nevada. So I thank you, the panelists, for your candor and not taking the bait sometimes when some of my colleagues try to bait you into some conversations. The truth matters, and most importantly, how do we address housing matters, and being honest about it. So let me talk a little bit about Nevada, because one of the things I do know, it is a supply issue. There's no doubt about it. We have to address the supply. But we also have to address the affordability. I have working families that can't afford homes. So it's not just the supply. It's how do we ensure that no matter your station in life, you can afford that home, because the homes that are being built in my state are a little bit more costly, quite honestly, because we got to get federal land. 80% of the land is owned by the federal government. So the first step in building housing is getting that land from the federal government. That's the first cost that now is associated with building those homes. So now we have to figure out how we level the playing field so we can lower those costs. It is about building, but it's also the financing that goes into that building to ensure that we can keep some of those costs low enough for those families, those working families, to be able to afford these homes. And one of those programs that we have at the federal level that I still believe in, I think we need to continue to utilize it and modernize it, is the home program. And so let me, Ms. Willis, let me ask you, I have a bill, which is the home bill, which is S948. And what it does is the home program that was, I want to say it was created in 1994, has not been reauthorized, reformed, or anything since 1994. So what I've done is taken it, updated it to make sure it works better for our families and our communities, and introduced it yesterday. So, Ms. Willis, can I ask you, how does the home program contribute to building more affordable homes for those working families? Like in my state, where we have to address one key piece of that cost was getting that federal land first.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And also thank you for your leadership in introducing the legislation to improve the home program. Home, as you know, it acts as it's another financing structure to allow deals to pencil out. And so it is a critical source of gap financing, and so it is important. So we would certainly love to continue working with you to improve home so that it better supports CHODOs, which are community housing development organizations, so that they can better serve extremely low-income households.
Thank you. And then, Dr. Glaser, thank you so much. I had a question for you on manufactured homes, but you answered it, and I thank you for your candor there. But let me ask you this. You also talked a little bit about federal land, and can you expand on your view that using federal land for housing is not by itself going to meet the affordable housing needs of this country? I'm curious if you would expand on that thought a little bit more.
So thank you very much for your question, and thank you for your interest in manufactured homes as well. And I'm also interested in the idea of putting pre-zoning federal land for manufactured housing. We can think about combining the two as well. I think all federal land should be taken on a case-by-case basis. And we should think about it. My comment, I don't think it's going to solve America's affordable housing problem, is because it's not in places where is often not in the places where we have an affordability crisis, right? And there are many parts of America which just don't have substantial amounts of federal land anywhere nearby. I mean, it's impossible to imagine in Greater Boston what federal land we would use to solve that problem. But there are parts of America where there is federal land. And I believe strongly that we should use serious analysis and think about whether or not more of that federal land should be allocated towards housing. I will just say, if we do allocate it towards housing, let's figure out a way to get as much housing on it as possible. And I think things like large-scale manufactured housing is one way of doing that.
Thank you,
Senator.
I couldn't agree more, and that's why a piece of legislation that I have introduced in another committee is a Lands Management Act. Clark County particularly focuses on how we get more of that federal land for our use for economic development, but also for housing. That is unique, by the way, to the Western states. Most of my colleagues don't have to come to the legislature to pass legislation to get land for housing. We do. And so I appreciate your comments around there as well. And then, Ms. Willis, thank you. One final thing, and let me just stress the federal home loan banks. I think there's a role for them to play. And it's not a new role. It's one that is in their original charter that they're required to participate in, which is this idea that they are supposed to and obligated to think about how they invest in housing and economic development in our communities. And I just, Ms. Willis, do you think federal home loan banks can do more to support housing?
Sure, yes. I would say that we need every use of every resource available to address the affordable housing crisis and homelessness crisis. And I really do applaud you for looking at common sense ways to do that and to increase those resources. And we would certainly love to continue working with you and your team and your staff to ensure that those new resources better serve extremely low-income households.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you as well. Senator Banks.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for having this hearing. This is such an important topic, and I've learned so much. So I appreciate everyone who's been here today. The price of a typical home in Indiana has gone up 60% in 5 years. And I think, Mr. Chairman, that what we're talking about today, how much home ownership is linked to the American dream, this is fundamental to why we're here and what we're here to work toward. And that's why I think this hearing is so important. Dr. Glaser, you've studied and written papers on the differences between building a home and buying an existing home. And I wonder if you can unpack some of your findings. What does it mean for the future of the American dream when as that gap between the two changes? What did it used to be? What is it now? Maybe I'm not making enough sense, but there's a divide there that's changing rapidly, and I wonder what that means.
Thank you, Senator. That's a wonderful question. It gives me a chance to sort of talk a little bit about some of the basic evidence about how we know how powerful zoning is. So the basic logic of economics is that if you have a relatively competitive market, the price of what it costs to buy something should be close to what it costs to make something, right? Otherwise, more competitors are going to come in, and construction is a really competitive industry. But increasingly, about 20 years ago, a body of evidence that I was involved with primarily documented a growing gap between how much it costs to buy and how much it costs to build. In really dense environments, you can just look at how much it costs to buy an apartment in New York City versus how much it costs to build. And the beauty of that is the building is just physical. You can always just add an extra story. And it was twice as much, right, 20 years ago, and it's more today, right? And so I heard some language about zoning adding 25%. This is more like land use controls doubling the effective price. In lower density environments, it's a little bit harder because you've got to price the land and you don't actually often know that. But one of the tricks that we have is that we can compare how much an acre is worth if it extends an existing lot versus how much an acre is worth if it sits under an existing lot. And the answer is, in many of our environments, it's 10 times more valuable if it sits on an existing, under a house versus extends an existing lot. And so with those tools, we can say that, in fact, the gap between the land cost plus the housing cost and how much it costs to buy has just gone way, way up. And that's a way that we know that, it's one of my favorite ways to knowing that land use regulations are really playing an outsized role of this. Now, I think of Indiana as being typically a place where, it is relatively easy to build. But it is clear that places where I once thought it was easy to build are becoming harder. And as it becomes harder, that wedge between buying costs and building cost has just expanded.
What's healthy? What do we want that gap to look like?
I'd 20% for land costs, 25% for land costs.
You point to a year or a time where there was a healthy gap between building and buying?
Oh, well, Senator, for most of the time when we started working, it was actually typically less expensive to buy than it was to build in most of America. And the reason for that is, houses, as has been mentioned before, houses depreciate. And so the new houses that were being bought are actually at a premium. And so building a house was actually more expensive than it was to buy a typically used house. So typically it was negative. That would be a fantastic thing to get back to that, where it actually costs more to build than it does to buy the typical home.
I think we understand why. It's zoning and regulations and those issues that are driving it. One other question I had for you. A lot of the affordable housing programs for the federal government are focused on building apartments, and apartments are good, and a lot of Hoosiers live in apartments, but there are a lot of first-time homebuyers that want to buy a single-family house rather than live in an apartment. I mean, can you talk about how we can reform some programs to give first-time homebuyers an opportunity using federal support to achieve that American dream rather than living in an apartment?
One thing I would think about is to think about how particularly HUD treats manufactured housing. I think there are some very exciting things that are going on in manufactured housing. In fact, there are exciting things going on in the state of Indiana in manufactured housing. The city of Chicago is actually looking to source its manufactured homes for public housing from Indiana, in fact, from an Indiana producer. I think making sure that HUD doesn't discriminate against manufactured housing would be a great thing in terms of making ordinary homes affordable to first-time home buyers, and then in general just sort of leaning against local land use regulations. And it's important to remember that even if the homes that are being built are sort of too expensive for first-time home buyers, because they alleviate the pressure on the used housing, they're still good for affordability for first-time buyers.
Really helpful and interesting. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Senator.
Thanks, Senator Banks. Appreciate that. Senator Warnock.
Well, thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman. We have a housing availability and affordability crisis in this country, and I'm especially concerned about young Americans and their ability to pay rent or buy their first home. I grew up in public housing, and I've been reflecting these days on the fact that I was able to buy my first home pretty young. But young folks coming along now, it's tough. Dr. Glazer, you're a Harvard economics professor. Are you concerned about what you're seeing in the economic data about young Americans and home ownership?
Thank you, Senator. I certainly am.
And go ahead.
I had added a paper of mine from the Journal of Economic Perspectives from 5 years ago, which looks at many consequences of housing regulation, one of which is a transfer of housing wealth from the young to the old. And we compared 2013 and 1983, since it was some time ago. 1983, there were plenty of 25 to 34-year-olds that had substantial housing wealth. That's just gone. But by contrast, if you look at the 65 to 74-year-olds or the 75 pluses, right, at the top end of that distribution, they are enormously wealthy. And so if you bought a home in Los Angeles in 1973, you have done spectacularly well, right? But if you're trying to buy a home in Los Angeles in 2025, you're not so well off.
1973, ancient history for young folks.
Indeed.
Folks that age. But
Indeed.
so I'm just talking about the college students I know. Massive transfers, seriously, of wealth, and a lack of the inability, particularly to pass wealth from one generation to the next. It's moving in the wrong direction, which has implications for all of us, regardless of our generation. This is a big problem that will require big solutions. And last year, we actually saw the largest increase in rental costs in a decade, while the share of first-time home buyers reached an all-time low. So tough pickings, whether you're a renter or looking to rent or buy. Georgia has the lowest homeownership rate in the entire Southeast. Ms. Willis, what are the consequences of high rental costs and lack of affordable housing on upward mobility and the broader economy?
Thank you, Senator. I think on an individual level, when people with low incomes can't afford housing, they're forced to make impossible trade-offs. So we're talking about trade-offs between paying rent and buying groceries, or medications, or investing in their children's education. But more broadly, I would say, that researchers have found that housing constraints have lowered GDP growth. And it by 36% over the study period. And in any given year, GDP was 3.7% lower. And so part of the answer, yes, is zoning reforms, as we talked about today.
So this is, and I'll let you continue. So this is not just bad for the folks who are buying homes. It's bad for all of us.
Absolutely. That's right.
Continue.
Absolutely. And, and again, zoning reforms are important. We talked about that a bit here today. But it needs to address the market failures that impacts households with the lowest incomes. And so because the market cannot by itself serve these households without federal investments.
What do young people or folks who are just trying to buy their first home, first-time home buyers, what do they cite most often as the biggest barrier?
2 words: down payment costs.
Down payment costs, absolutely. So I know that to be the case, and that's why I introduced the Rent Relief Act and the Down Payment Towards Equity Act with some of my colleagues. I think these are important bills that address the affordability issue around and the accessibility issue around housing, because when the private market fails to address our housing crisis, the government must help with smart investments. And so we get a healthy balance between the private and the public sector trying to make this work. Let me be clear, government can also get in the way, especially local government. Dr. Glazer, does our housing shortage have roots in restrictive local zoning regulations? You were beginning, I think, to talk about that a little while ago.
I believe that very strongly, Senator, and I've been trying to make this point for 25 years, and I think the problem has only gotten worse. And yes, the problem is fundamentally localities saying no to adding density, to adding homes, and they're fundamentally saying no to the American dream.
Thank you so much. This restrictive zoning, often a legacy of Jim Crow era racism, let's be clear, is still a persistent problem, and it's a problem even in blue cities under Democratic leadership. And that's why I agree with the chairman and many of my Republican friends across the aisle that we've got to solve our housing crisis. And this will absolutely require regulatory right sizing. We'll never make a dent in our housing shortage. I think also in addition to that, without federal investments, like my 2 bills, as well as my bill with the ranking member to construct 3 million new housing units and lower housing costs for all. This is a serious issue, and I think we need bipartisan solutions. Thank you so very much.
Thanks, Senator. I look forward to you and Senator Moreno working together on solving these issues. Senator McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Warren, and thank you to a great panel. In addition to being an integral part of the American Dream, homeownership obviously carries great financial benefit, as the home for many families is the most important asset. When I'm back in Pennsylvania, I consistently hear about this problem, the difficulty of affording a home. Across Pennsylvania, housing prices are up 11% over the last year, and major metro areas, in particular Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, rank near the bottom nationally of new home construction. So the American dream that we all want for everyone is slipping away because of this mismatch between supply and demand. So Mayor Johnson, good to see you. I know you're from my wife's hometown and a good friend of hers, and work closely with her. Could you give us a perspective as a big city mayor on the challenges you particularly have faced with housing construction and stories you may have heard from other mayors?
Well, Senator, I appreciate the question. I think, so Dallas, the city of Dallas proper, which I'm the mayor of, is surrounded by several vibrant, what used to be bedroom communities, but are now relatively large, successful suburbs in their own right. And the metro area that we form together, we call the Metroplex or the DFW region, is soon to be the third largest metro area in the United States, and it's the fastest growing in the United States. It's 8 million people, and it's a very dynamic region with a lot of job growth, a lot of economic opportunity. I describe us as the buckle of the Sun Belt, and the Sun Belt is the fastest growing part of the United States population-wise and economically. And so there is no shortage of folks who want to do business in our neck of the woods, home building included. But they have choices to make in where they do that building. And one of my challenges as the mayor of Dallas is to make Dallas a more competitive place for them to do that vis-a-vis our surrounding communities. One of the most common things I hear from folks who are in that line of work about why not Dallas and why someplace else is the permitting process. Yep. And how cumbersome it can be to navigate that process. And so that is why I've been so focused on that while I've been mayor. But your question, I think, highlights something that I really want to emphasize for this committee, and I alluded to it before about how this has to come to Congress in my mind, and it has to be on y'all's minds if we're going to address it for your constituents, whoever those may be, is that this is a national competition for the same people, and the problem just moves around the country.
Yeah.
It just moves around. We benefit from being more affordable, so to speak, than California, but Oklahoma City benefits from being more affordable than Dallas, and just kind of keep pushing it around. We have to deal with it, I think, in a national manner, and for sure, I think the solution and the answer is to increase the amount of homes that are being built, and a big barrier to it is how long it takes to get the projects done.
That's what we're hearing across the board. I'm going to move to Ms. Willis for a second. I want to talk about veterans, homelessness. I know, Mayor, you've had success in Dallas with that. I wondered if you could just comment on the collaboration you've seen between the VA and HUD on this, and what the national trends you're seeing on veterans homelessness.
Sure. Thank you for the question. I would say that, homelessness, there's documented studies in terms of with Housing First, with making sure that homeless veterans are housed. And so there's a study that at least the success rate is over 50%. And so there's...
is it getting better?
Yeah, it's certainly getting better, because as you probably know, that there are on any given night over 770,000 people who are living on the streets every night. But in terms of veterans homelessness, the trend is that it's being solved and getting better. But we certainly do want to see more.
Good, thank you. And Dr. Glazer, I want to get your big brain into this for a second, which is just if you look current course. For this committee to think about without a change in the overall posture of policymakers, what would you think housing prices are going to do in the next 5 years?
So I'm going to dodge that one, Senator, just to be honest, because corrections are always possible, and I don't want to be on the record for the next 5. Let me say, if we do nothing,
you should learn to hedge. I mean, we all know how to do that. Come on,
give me a longer time horizon, Senator, and I see no reason why we're going to correct course in any way. right? So give me 10 years, give me 15 years so we can get past whatever housing cycle might emerge in the next 5 years. It feels to me like it is in America in which more and more of this country is closed off to opportunity, is closed off to people finding a future. You know, when I was a kid, I read this book called The Rise and Decline of Nations by Manker Olson. And it was a book about how stable societies get captured by insiders and make it impossible for outsiders to find a fortune. When I read this coming off of Reagan's America, that didn't feel like my America then. It feels more and more like America now. And that's why I think it is so important for your committee to make sure that an America of opportunity continues everywhere.
We'll end on Manker Olson. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Blunt Rochester.
Thank you, Chairman, Chairman Scott and Ranking Member Warren, for this really thoughtful hearing on housing. Thank you to the panel for all of your testimony. I think it's abundantly clear when you just listen to every member here, every senator, that we all recognize that we have a housing crisis in this country. And I hope, Mr. Mayor, this provides some hope to you that we recognize we're in this together. Buying a home has never been more expensive. There are Delawareans right now who have worked to get a down payment, but for a new home, it could cost them $500,000 just to put down, you know, to be able to afford a house. And so we know that this is a challenge. And I think about building generational wealth. I think about workforce housing. We have doctors and nurses and firefighters who can't afford housing. I think about the root causes of those who are unhoused and how we tackle this. And whether it's our veterans, our seniors, or young people, this is literally affecting everybody in this country. And so, Dr. Glazer, I wanted to ask my first question of you as the nation's most preeminent scholar on housing, land use, and the economy. Could you talk to us a little bit about, in your research, you mentioned restrictive land use policies have created an imbalance of supply and demand. And I've focused a lot on zoning reform and cutting regulatory barriers and cutting red tape in the House and now in the Senate. But could you talk a little bit about the overall economic impact of a lack of housing supply and why everybody, whether you're a small business or a family, should care?
Thank you very much, Senator, for your question. Thank you for your leadership in this topic, in this area. This is a national problem, as I mentioned in my testimony, as was mentioned by Ms. Willis. Our nation is poorer as a result of this, right? Because we move to places where it's possible to build, rather than places in which people would necessarily want to live. And that means our overall GDP is lower than it was. That means fewer tax dollars. That means less ability to meet our foreign policy requirements. All of that weakens us fundamentally as a country. I believe that we are also a country that is has less upward mobility because we particularly regulate those communities that are really good at turning kids of poor parents into middle-income adults. Those are the areas that are most restrictive when we look across areas. And I'm relying on my colleague Raj Chetty's data on upward mobility to do that, but you really see this in the data. And it's just tragic, right? There are some parts of America that are just great at turning poor kids into middle-income adults, and we should be trying to make sure as many kids manage to get there as possible, and yet we don't because of local land use regulations that just say no. And it is precisely because, right, these local rules have national consequences that I think it is appropriate for your committee to take up this issue. That this is no longer just an issue for one town or one area. This is an issue that in fact impacts all of us. It impacts the intergenerational accumulation of wealth, as you said. It's a redistribution across space, and it just makes us less dynamic than we could be.
And I want to put a finer point on what we've heard that I think all of us consider local land use and zoning reforms to be critical to unlocking new housing supply. And it's why I last year introduced a bipartisan bill, the Housing Supply and Innovation Frameworks Act, in the House, and have worked to co-develop the Reducing Regulatory Barriers to Housing Act. And these bills would reimagine outdated zoning laws and cut red tape. But we also know that we need the local level support. They're the ones that are making these land use decisions. I want to jump to the issue of breaking down barriers and cutting red tape, but also talking about shared equity housing models. I think we need innovation, not just in addition to what we do on land use, we need innovation as well. And so when I think about like shared equity models, I think about community land trusts and creating permanently affordable homes while still building wealth and delivering on the promise of home ownership. To the panel, do you think that shared equity models, housing models, play a role in addressing the housing crisis and achieve home ownership for moderate income Americans, or other innovative solutions that you might have? And I'll start with you, Ms. Willis.
Sure, thank you for that question, Senator. Absolutely. I think shared ownership example, and when I think about those, I think about community land trusts, as you mentioned, as being a really good resource, and an example of a shared equity model. And so certainly would encourage you and your colleagues to expand opportunities for community land trusts, as well as shared equity programs in general for home ownership, because it does allow opportunities for people to move into home ownership and to continue.
Thank you. I actually am preparing legislation in this area, so I will share that with the committee. But I want to, again, we will ask some more questions for the record, but again, I want to thank you all for your testimony and your work in ensuring that Americans can live a prosperous life, and that the children, like I did, my parents also lived in public housing for a while, and to be able to be the first to go into that first home that my parents bought is nothing like it. There's nothing like it. So thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Senator Blunt Rochester has been here the entire hearing, and I thank you for your patience. It took a while to get to you, but truly appreciate your willingness to stick around on such an important topic that many of us have shared experiences that hopefully lead to shared solutions as well. Senator Also Brooks.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chair, Ranking Member Warren, and to this committee, thank you so much to the panelists for being here today. We all recognize, I know it's been said several times today, that home ownership is a key feature to building wealth in our country. And when I think about this subject, I think about my parents. My mother, who spent her 50 years as a receptionist, my father, who was a car salesman. They married at 21 and 22. And at that time, within 5 years of their marriage, they could afford to buy a home. That is no longer the case. It's no longer the expectation for my own daughter, who's 19. So I've spent the last several years, I was county executive, really focused on expanding home ownership, working to really leverage private sector dollars with public sector dollars. We were able to build or preserve about 5,000 units in about a 3-year period. And so I wonder, the first question for Dr. Glaser, I wonder if you can speak to the need to really better allocate private capital into projects that promote home construction and ownership.
Thank you, Senator. I also have a 19-year-old daughter, and so your comment about that made me just feel how much I agreed with your sentiment about how utterly implausible a home within 7 years would be for her. I think it's fundamentally, when housing worked, private capital went to provide housing where demand was highest. And you certainly see this in the data. You see this in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, both across metropolitan areas and within metropolitan areas, that we built housing in places where demand was higher, where prices were higher, and that building process helped those prices come down. That building process took care of demand. That really ceased. And you see that in my Exhibit 3, that the places that are expensive, right, don't build a lot. The places that build a lot aren't expensive. And that's because the regulatory differences across space are determining where private capital is going, not the demand, not the economic core of what makes one place more valuable than the other, not the sort of fundamental need for opportunity in one place. And so these local regulations are shaping our country. They're shaping where private capital goes. They're shaping where we get new homes. They're shaping where we get new businesses. And they're all being decided at a hyper-local level, which, I love federalism in lots of different ways. I love individual choice, but none of these local town councils or whichever your community is making a decision saying what would be best for America in terms of what I'm doing. And that's, again, why I think it is so valuable that your committee is taking up this topic, that we sort of need a national voice on this.
Thank you. Just another question. You made a statement, and you said that America's housing crisis, Dr. Glaser, was a deep, self-inflicted wound. And I'm concerned, because we've heard a lot about tariffs recently, and I introduced some legislation to actually produce some data just to give us an idea about how it will increase or how it will impact cost of home building, which I think can further exacerbate the supply shortage that we see and keep the prices high. So I just wonder what impacts you believe President Trump's proposed tariffs will have on imported materials and how it will affect the cost of home building in the United States.
For 250 years, economists have generally thought that tariffs impose costs on consumers. That is certainly true. And this is I am not going to weigh in on whatever the complicated foreign policy dance that's going on that I don't understand, quite frankly, and I'm not going to do so. And so I'm not going to second guess that. But certainly if tariffs stay high, they're going to impose costs, and we're going to be able to see that over time.
Thank you. Just a final question for our mayor here. I know that in fiscal 2024, both the city of Baltimore as well as your city of Dallas received over $30 million in total federal support from HUD. And that includes the funding allocated through the HOME program, which I know we've heard a lot about today. I'm a co-sponsor of the legislation before this committee that would reauthorize and strengthen it. But would you just talk about the impact to Dallas communities if the funding for HUD programs is significantly reduced or eliminated?
Yeah, thank you for the question. A similar question was asked earlier, and I'll give you a similar answer because it's the truth. The specific impact, I don't have the data in front of me to tell you, what that has been, but I will tell you, as far as the whole array of federal programs related to housing, aimed at the lower income end of the spectrum. Even before I became the mayor, but certainly in the past 6 years, I do see that there is a value to these programs. I do see that they do create some increase year over year in the available housing stock aimed at that end of the income spectrum. My reason for really, really wanting to participate in today's discussion, and what I will tell you, is that I believe that that amount, even in a good year, is in the 3,000 to 5,000 unit range or something like that. And what we really need to be looking at are things that are going to substantially increase the amount of housing that's available throughout the city of Dallas across income levels. And again, I'm talking about creating enough housing where it relieves pressure for everyone from the young professional, your daughter, when she wants to move to Dallas and stop renting an apartment and become a homeowner, and to the folks who are currently living in a far-flung suburb who work in Dallas. Maybe they're a barista at a Starbucks, but with what they're making, they have to live very, very far away. Workforce housing, things like that. I feel like we have to force ourselves to get out of this box of only thinking about housing affordability in terms of these federal programs and how much more money we can put into these and how many more people we can serve with those, and start thinking about how to have wholesale movements along the supply curve and the amount of housing that we're producing. And I don't think there's a source other than the private sector to do it. I mean, I would tell you, if I really believed that the government could do it, I would say it, but I don't think they can.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Gallego.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Willis, Arizona experienced significant population growth in recent years, which, as you know, brings unique housing challenges. Despite being the 5th largest city in the U.S., Phoenix receives about 7,400 vouchers, far fewer than Philadelphia, the 6th largest city, which receives over 22,000 vouchers. This is why I introduced the Housing Voucher Fairness Act to allocate additional housing choice vouchers in our fastest growing cities, which assist families in affordable rental housing. Can you talk about the unique challenges that fast growing cities face and solutions that you have seen actually work?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for the Housing Choice Voucher, the Housing Voucher Fairness Act. So we're happy to look into this issue, but I think it raises some significant issues because right now only 1 out of 4 eligible households for housing assistance really gets any help. The others have to essentially fend for themselves, and that's 3 out of 4. And Congress certainly should be working to ensure that rental assistance is available universally to all eligible households.
Well, thank you. And one of the things that we discovered, the reason why there is a disparity is that the housing voucher allocation is based off the 2000 census. So if you're fast-growing cities like Houston, Dallas, Las Vegas, you're actually going to be disproportionately penalized for having good policies and growing versus some of these older cities that are essentially atrophying, but yet we're being punished. So even an update just on using the most recent census would actually be more accurate. And I hope that we'll be working on that legislation too. And I hope my colleagues will help join us there.
Sure. And if I can just add to that too, and I think it is important you mentioned data. In terms of the data that HUD collects, because we certainly do, again, going back to wanting to protect those programs and the staff at HUD, because 76% in the office in HUD is being threatened, to cut the staff there. And it is important to have that data to understand the housing issue and how we can correct it.
Right. And one of the things, since we were talking about cuts, Arizona's unique, one of the unique states where we have 22 federally recognized tribes. We have the largest tribal enrollment in the country, lots of land, but of course we have a housing challenge. So the firing, obviously, of and closing down of some of our tribal Bureau of Indian Affairs offices makes things difficult, especially when we're trying to apply for housing grants for some of these tribal nations. So I'm going to introduce to the record a letter that myself and Senator Kelly wrote about our opposition to the closing of these offices, which again will exacerbate a housing crisis that's actually on. People don't understand. We actually have on tribal lands, even a housing crisis even there. I have another question, Mr. Glasser, and this is something that I've noticed, is that many Californians are moving to Arizona, and instead of downsizing their homes, right, they're selling a pretty valuable property for $1.5 million in California, and then they're just coming to Arizona and they're buying nearly that amount. Why are they doing that? Explain the tax implication of why they're doing that.
Well, I think it's the thank you, Senator, for that question. I think the appeal of Arizona should be obvious to anyone.
Great! I can go on and on.
And certainly,
but the reason they're selling their house at $1.2 million, and it's a paid-off house, and instead of going and getting this retired couple, a man and a woman, partner, whatever it is. Instead of going and getting a nice house, a condo, and pocketing the rest of the money, they're not doing that. They're buying a house almost of equivalent value. What is the reasoning for that? It's not a trick question. I could answer that.
No. Well, the first order thing is you go to a place where housing is cheaper, you buy more house. Right. We believe as economists that people respond to prices, and if housing is cheaper, you wouldn't be surprised if they spent $1.8 million on the house because they could get so much more house for their buck in California, in Arizona than in California. All
right. Well, the reason also is because if that family sells that house and they don't buy a house of equivalent or close to equivalent value, they're going to end up paying capital gains on that house. So a retired couple, instead of trying to just pay the government the money, which I actually agree with them, they shouldn't pay that. We should figure out a way to actually give them a capital gains tax cut, because what actually ends up happening is that then they would come to Arizona, buy a smaller place, and then they could keep that money, that capital gains, for their own retirement. Instead, what they're doing is they're buying an equivalent house that at least keeps some value. And so one of the things I'd love to think about is how are we, basically incentivizing these well-to-do retirees into buying houses that they don't necessarily need to buy, because that's the only thing that actually brings them some level of economic value and stability. So with that, I apologize, Mr. Chair, because I complained about going over time, and I yield back my time.
Sounds like an opportunity for us to work together. The TCJA relates to increasing the amount of money that you don't have to pay capital gains on once you sell your house after 2 years. So look forward to that. Any closing comments? Okay, great. Let me just say, what a wonderful hearing we've had today as it relates to dealing with the housing challenges that we're facing across the country. I know we all leave, I think, better educated from the experts that took your time, frankly, traveled from across the country to be with us today. We want to thank you all for doing so. It's been an illuminating hearing, and one that there will be follow-up, there will be legislation, and frankly, I pray that it will be on the president's desk this year for us to have actual housing reform that leads to more housing out there. Housing affordability issues are important to this committee and to me personally, and I look forward to continuing the committee's work on this topic throughout the year. For senators who wish to submit questions for the hearing record, those questions are due 1 week from today, Wednesday, March 26th, to our witnesses. You have 45 days from that day to submit your responses to questions for the record. Thank you so much. This committee is adjourned.